Welcome everyone to the Social Innovation Speaker Series. I'm your host. My name is Ann Owens. I'm an Associate Professor of Sociology at USC and an Associate Director of the USC Price Center for Social Innovation. A quick plug, if you're not on our email list, please do visit our website, socialinnovation.usc.edu. Coming up next Friday, we have the second day of our Social Innovation Summit, which is going to feature panels on social movements and social enterprise. So if that sounds appealing, be sure to check it out and register. Today, we are thrilled to welcome Professor Stefanie DeLuca to our speaker series. She is the James Coleman Professor of Social Policy and Sociology at Johns Hopkins University, where she directs the Social Policy Program and the Poverty and Inequality Research Lab. She's a model scholar to me and to the field for producing mixed methods research using sociological perspectives to inform education and housing policy. And today, we'll be hearing about her work with the Creating Moves to Opportunity experiment. We will have a Q&A session after Professor DeLuca's presentation. I understand that people are watching both via Zoom and streaming live on Facebook. So if you're watching via Zoom, you can put your question in the Q&A box, which you should see somewhere probably at the bottom of your screen. And if you are watching us via Facebook, you can put your question in the comment section and we'll integrate it into our Q&A here. So I think that's all the logistics I need to talk about. And with that, I'll hand it over to our guest today, Professor Stefanie DeLuca. Welcome, Stefanie.
Right. Thank you for having me. This is wonderful. And as I was telling Anne before we started, I certainly do wish I was in Southern California, but it's glad to have a bunch of people able to join who might not otherwise be. Great. Thanks, everybody. It's exciting to have folks on Facebook Live and also everybody here on Zoom. I'm here presenting work that is a collaborative project with a number of economists at Harvard, Columbia, and MIT. So it's a joint project that we've been working on for a while. So I want to give credit to my collaborators, Peter Bergman, Raj Chetty, Nathan Hendren, Larry Katz, and Chris Palmer, as well as the Seattle Housing Authority, the King County Housing Authority, and additional research partners, MEF Associates, J-PAL North America, and MDRC, who gave us a research support. I'm going to talk today about an RCT to expand residential choice and opportunity that we started from scratch from the beginning with our partners. This is our one of the most exciting things about this collaboration isn't that we're researchers who descended on a site and said, hey, will you let us do a study here? But our partners in Seattle and King County, upon learning about the increasing research base showing that neighborhoods matter, sort of came to us and said, we'd like to try to do a better job serving our families in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. So this is, a really special aspect of the collaboration for me, and I know for the rest of the team. Obviously, we don't have a lot of time, and I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff out from different kinds of disciplinary perspectives and methodological approaches. But I just wanted to motivate the work quickly with a few different facts, and happy to elaborate in Q&A on any one of them. But we've been learning now for, over 30 years across a number of disciplines that it's not just the family the child is born into, but the neighborhood she grows up in that shapes her long-term prospects. And we know that these prospects are unequally distributed across what we think of as the geography of opportunity. And we've seen the research base has shown us, especially through the Moving to Opportunity experiment, that we can improve economic outcomes in adulthood by investing in children's neighborhoods early on. And so we sort of have actionable research evidence. So, we also have a policy in place already that is in some ways intended to do this, but doesn't in practice. We have the Housing Choice Voucher Program, formerly known as Section 8, but often still called the Section 8 program, that provides housing assistance in form of rental vouchers to be used in the private market. It's the bulk of the nation's public housing is delivered through this program. Now where families get a voucher that they can use to rent somewhere in the private market where landlords will accept them. But we know that the majority of low-income families who receive housing vouchers predominantly live in low-opportunity neighborhoods. So we have an opportunity here, a policy opportunity that's squandered, in other words, based on squaring the research evidence with the policy performance. Just to give an example, the 25 census tracts in the city of Seattle and King County where voucher holders are most likely to move are what we think of as low opportunity neighborhoods using the Opportunity Atlas that Raj Chetty and colleagues at Opportunity Insights have developed. So we're seeing right here that we have this rare, precious, and potentially effective subsidy, but it isn't being leveraged in many metro areas the way that it could be. So part of the question is why? Okay, and as a sociologist who works with lots of economists, I'm going to kind of blend these together. I think there are a number of explanations that come from our fields that help explain why we don't see more low-income families moving to higher opportunity neighborhoods, despite having there be some of the affordability constraints relaxed through the voucher program. But typically we invoke economic resource constraints as a reason why we don't see low-income families moving to higher opportunity neighborhoods. Of course, again, with the voucher program, a large piece of this is removed, but not all of it. It may be that families, have preferences for different kinds of neighborhoods because of things like proximity to family, commute time, things that maybe outside observers don't see that help inform the decisions families make. And it may be that, there are barriers that prevent families from finding housing in high opportunity neighborhoods. There's lack of information, other kinds of frictions, structural barriers like landlord, racial discrimination in the housing market. I think that we've seen that the economic resources argument alone is not adequate, both with evidence from the voucher program, but other observational work in sociology that shows we still see, for example, racial segregation, even when accounting for economic resources. And I think, and also we know from attitudinal surveys that low-income families and families of color report preferring to live in neighborhoods that they typically don't end up moving to. So, we're converging on the importance of barriers, although economic resources and preferences matter in interacting with barriers. This is work Maria Creason and Kyle Crowder have been doing lately to really kind of get us to think more broadly about how these forces interact. But we know that there are some barriers that are outside of families' control that we can possibly do something about to reduce segregation by income and race, and also increase the performance of the housing choice voucher policy. So how do we do that? So I'm going to talk today about a randomized field trial that we conducted in Seattle to test policy scalable strategies to reduce these kinds of barriers in Seattle and King County, which are sort of our first sites for expanding on some of the original work from the Moving to Opportunity experiment, which I can also talk more about in Q&A. Before I jump into the work that we did in Seattle and King County, I want to give some shout outs to the folks that came before. The kind of work we're describing today, these advances in housing policy, opening up residential choice for poor families and families of color, in part has been motivated by original work done in fair housing, and important class action desegregation lawsuits. And so Alex Polikoff, Barbara Samuels, and some of these other housing advocates have been instrumental in getting us to even start as early as the 1960s in the landmark Chicago Gautreaux v. HUD case, which opened up opportunities for families in Chicago to move to more integrated neighborhoods. And the courts found that HUD and Chicago's Housing Authority were liable for administering the subsidized program in such a way as to segregate families in mostly racially isolated poor neighborhoods. And without this sort of backbone, we wouldn't have nearly the policy knowledge we have today. All of the mobility demonstrations have stemmed from these, the hard work of these legal advocates. There's also a lot of urban sociology that we build off of, everything from Wilson's groundbreaking Truly Disadvantaged, Massey and Denton's American Apartheid, these seminal books that came out, The Truly Disadvantaged in 1987 and American Apartheid in 93, that sort of woke us up to the fact that in the wake of the civil rights era, we still had quite a bit of work to do when we saw that rather than a decrease in racial segregation and income segregation after the civil rights era, we saw an increase in American cities. So there are a number of folks that deserve credit for the bedrock from which we drew conceptually. So as I mentioned, this is sort of there's a long history here of how we ended up with the Creating Moves to Opportunity program. And my career has sort of been shaped by being able to be part of all of these programs, from the Gautreaux program in the that was administered in the 70s through the 80s, all the way through to our Seattle program. Gautreaux, the Baltimore housing program, were both motivated by lawsuits. The Moving to Opportunity experiment was in response to some of the early findings of Gautreaux. As a federally funded demonstration experiment in 5 cities, from which we started to learn, although it took 20 years, how important neighborhoods really are for children and for some select outcomes in adulthood. And the Seattle study is an expansion on these promising findings, which gained a lot of momentum when Raj Chetty, Larry Katz, and Nathan Hendren published their working paper in 2015 showing, with the tax data, showing these long-term benefits for children whose parents signed up for MTO and moved to low poverty neighborhoods. So we're sort of building on this base and trying to figure out how, not only how to get it right, but can we scale it? And so the best practices for many of these programs are built into the Seattle intervention. So to just give a little overview of the data we're using, the Seattle study is if families were eligible if they had a child below the age of 15. This is in part based on the fact that we know that that the effects of neighborhoods are more pronounced at younger ages. And we launched this RCT in April of 2018. So we've had what we think of as our phase 1 families have moved and have since had more than a year of post-move duration so that we can observe possible persistence. There are about 400 families in the experiment. And then we have administrative and survey data on those families. But what my team also did is took a stratified random sample of about 200 families to do semi-structured narrative interviews. And we got an 80% response rate. I'm happy to talk more about how that is. These are in-person interviews. The follow-ups are now being conducted remotely. But it's difficult work to get this kind of response rate. And I think, we borrow elements from typically quantitative work when we do our sampling. But this way, the qualitative work provides more than just texture to the quantitative and experimental work. It sort of really gives a sense of what's happening on the ground and what mechanisms are for families. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So the way that the experiment worked is that families were given the option of getting more assistance if they opted to move to an opportunity neighborhood designated. I show you here the map. The blue hatched areas are the opportunity neighborhoods in Seattle City and the surrounding King County. And these, again, are neighborhoods that are designated high opportunity based on the opportunity atlas that Raj Chetty and his team at Opportunity Insights have been maintaining, which are essentially neighborhoods where children, where we've observed the neighborhoods that children have grown up in over time to see which neighborhoods are more likely to promote income and economic mobility. And it's a bit of a different measure than sort of looking at a top-down measure of neighborhood poverty rate or racial composition, but what kinds of neighborhoods promote the economic prospects for children across incomes, especially for low-income children. So the key elements in the intervention, so there's lots to say and could sort of dig in a lot about kind of how the intervention developed over time from an implementation standpoint, which is interesting. There'll be an implementation report coming out soon that details this, sort of a practice, or almost a practice handbook. But the key elements in the intervention, again, building off of past work and past mobility interventions, it sort of fall into 3 buckets. There's the customized housing search assistance. increased landlord engagement, and short-term targeted flexible financial assistance. And each of these is sort of targeting these ideas of barriers to families' moves to opportunity neighborhoods. And the intervention is administered by a non-profit group in Seattle with staff who are kind of split into two groups. They're housing navigators, who are rather family navigators, who are family-facing staff who sort of meet one-on-one and talk to families to sort of, give them some information about the higher opportunity neighborhoods in the area that if they were to move to, they would get additional assistance. And there's, rental coaching, sort of helping families figure out how to present, but, a spotty rental resume, as it were, where there might be some credit problems. Sort of how do you talk to landlords about that? So credit discrimination is a big issue in the Seattle area. And there's some direct housing search assistance. The increased landlord engagement is a big piece. Obviously, with the family-facing services are essential, but also having the landlord supply side facing services are essential as well. Talk to the property owners and property management staff who are providing the housing itself, and trying to cultivate relationships with landlords and ensure against any damage, sort of, respecting the fact that landlords are, have a business. They want to maintain that they have property. They don't want to lose money. They don't want to have to deal with a lot of hassle. And the short-term financial assistance is for these extra costs, these sort of things up front that make it difficult, often seeming, small amounts like application fees or, security deposits. So this is where these are the things that the intervention targets, again, with their family navigator staff, and then the housing navigator staff focus more on the landlord facing side. And these are the staff that are supporting families in the treatment group. I'll go just quickly on the statistics for the experimental sample, just to point out that these are very low income families, considering that the median household income in the Seattle area is about $90,000. It kind of gives you some perspective on how low income relative to the rest of the area we're talking about. But a diverse sample in terms of a country of origin, race, and ethnicity as well. And so happy to talk more about the statistics if folks want to do that in Q&A. So the sort of big takeaway so far in our study is this striking experimental impact on the fraction of families who leased up in high opportunities areas as a result of participation in the intervention. So here, this chart is showing, a 38 percentage point difference in the proportion of families between the treatment and control group who moved to opportunity neighborhoods as a result of CMTO. And the dashed line is showing the historical mean rate for the housing authorities who are partners. So this is, quite a marked improvement on the conventional voucher program in the area. And we see both the control and treatment group leased up and at high levels. And so this isn't just about families moving at all, right? In the treatment group, or both groups, we saw high levels of lease up, but this is about helping families move to higher opportunity areas. And the effects look even larger if we condition it on leasing up. So this gives sort of a sense of just across the region where control group and treatment group families move. The red pin is the control group, and the green is the treatment group, and you can kind of see this dispersion. This also speaks to some questions about clustering. We saw families move to a wide variety of neighborhoods across the region, as opposed to concentrating in just one or two places, which is a concern, with the voucher recipients. The results also hold over a number of subgroup analyses that look at subgroups of families. We see that there are smaller impacts for Black non-Hispanic families, and I'm happy to talk more about that, although we do still see these large differences, but the differences hold across race and ethnicity subgroups. This is also true across families with different numbers of children, and also employed and non-employed families. And so we've done a number of different analyses that are in the paper to kind of show how the experimental impacts hold. We've done more recently some analyses on persistence. So we don't have long-term sort of individual level outcome data at this moment, but we're able to observe families past the point of their lease renewal. And so part of the question is, do we just see families move and then not enjoy where they were living, feel like they made a mistake and then leave? And at this point, that's not what we're observing for families who had a reasonable amount of time to leave their initial units. Here we're comparing the control and treatment group on their initial move, the percentage that were in a high opportunity neighborhood compared to for the sample who at least was past the 1 year mark when enrolled for even the most recent movers in the intervention who leased up at the end, the latest part of phase 1. So part of this, right, is a question about satisfaction as well. I mean, not having moved is, I think, a strong signal of satisfaction, but perhaps not, sufficient. So what we did when we did our qualitative interviews is we asked two standardized survey questions at the end of each interview about neighborhood satisfaction and likelihood of moving. And so we see also significant differences in the proportion of families in the treatment and control group who say they're satisfied with their new neighborhood and are interested in staying in the neighborhood. If we broke this out, we can break this out across the Likert scale and see differences at both at the highest end, but I think I'll skip that in the interest of time. So great, right? We have a story of an experiment of an intervention that worked, and seemed to have big treatment effects, but it's another thing to understand how it works. And I think increasingly, these are the questions we want to be asking when we're looking at policy, because there's always a question of policy take-up, right? And, what that tempers our expectations for what we can hope policies accomplish. I think then there's the question of sort of how policies work and what the mechanisms are. And if we don't understand that, we're left with sort of this black box, which makes scaling up impossible. So this is a part of why we paired the qualitative work and some of the ethnographic work alongside the experimental data in order to sort of really figure out what it was like on the ground for families who are in the intervention. And so we did that through the stratified random sample of families. We stratified by PHA, families who were at different points in the moving process when we pulled. So we had some families who were still moving, some families who had just moved. And we had a large collaborative team. This is a hallmark of the work we do at the Poverty and Inequality Research Lab. I think we're always smarter when we're not the only people who are left in the room. And we're the only people in the room, rather, when we have multiple eyes on, the same neighborhood blocks or, even in follow-up interviews, shared the same space with some of the same families. So it really gives us, a set of sounding boards. So we had a large team of folks who relocated some of my students at Hopkins, in addition to students at UW in our research group called MEF in Seattle. So we did these interviews. These are narrative in-depth interviews. I can elaborate a bit more on what we mean by that. These are not just open-ended survey questions. These are an opportunity for the research team to be educated by participants in an empowering generative process where the conversation is led by the respondents, in this case, the families in the CMTO program. We also did observations of intake sessions and interviews with key staff who are administering the program. I attended weekly meetings for the past few years on the implementation team. And we also have data that the navigators were collecting on their end to inform these questions. So here are just some of the unsung heroes in the upper left here, the family navigators, and a few shots of folks. The bottom left is a woman who runs the Seattle intake site for CMTO, who's just creates quite an experience for families. It's at that moment where you're trying to get someone to sign up for your study, where you're hitting the sort of random number generator to say you're in the treatment or control group. That moment is a tricky one, and I learned quite a bit from the staff about what it's like to do that. So as I mentioned, we're some of what we did was conducted these in-depth narrative interviews that are now longitudinal. And I think the importance of doing this is, as I said, to allow families to be the experts. Typically when low-income families or families of color are asked to describe what they're doing or what it's like to be in, if they're asked at all, what it's like to be in a program, it's, there's a power dynamic there at play that we like to flip, so that it's, we're not asking families to explain, their lives, but to tell us sort of how things work. I think it allows us to be in the position to be schooled, as opposed to in the position to judge. And I think this is a really important point I want to make about the interviews. Also, we can't come up with all of our best ideas sitting in our office, even though we have PhDs. And so these interviews keep our mind open to new possibilities and inductive ideas. And I think what it really lets us do is see that intersection between the everyday lives of people we hope to support, and the policy assumptions that are in our, that are the assumptions that are baked into our policies that we don't always see, and allows this everyday knowledge to yield valuable surprises. It's about understanding meaning-making, decision-making, not just describing action. This is a key part of the interview process. And as Sandy Jenks at Harvard describes better than I can when describing my colleague Kathy Edin's work, it's better to get interviews and observations with people who are willing to trust you and tell you the truth than to get a larger random sample of the population who'd lie to you. And this is kind of a point of saying, why would we talk to a smaller group of people and not doing a survey with thousands of people? So I think that puts a fine point on it. That said, a key piece of the process, as we do it, involves systematic sampling and high response rates. So what we were able to learn from the qualitative work, and this is, these are some of the mechanisms with prevalence rates from the coded data, were that there were at least 5 key mechanisms that were underneath these striking experimental results. The first one, which I think is of no surprise to any of you who've worked with vulnerable families and youth, is that the emotional support provided by the staff of CMTO and the supportive communication was vital. We asked families, for example, do you tell me about CMTO? A big open-ended question. And, what were the first things that we saw pop up? Tell me what was the most helpful thing, about CMTO. And of course, we asked, tell me what was missing. And, so we tried to get a real sense of what this was like. But emotional support was key, sort of this increased motivation to move to opportunity. So these 2 mechanisms together, I think, are interesting because, I think it's really difficult, especially in a market like Seattle, to be a low-income renter or a renter of color and try to lease affordable housing itself, there's not nearly enough of it, but trying to rent housing in a tight market and then have your credit run and get denied on the basis of credit because source of income discrimination is illegal in the state of Washington. But being turned away because of credit over and over again creates a sort of, residential pessimism. It's demoralizing, right? And here you have staff saying, we'd like to find out what it is that you want for your family. What's your vision? What kinds of things you want? How can a move help support that? Part of the intervention is to help, the pitch originally is to help families move to the kinds of neighborhoods research shows are supportive of children's long-term prospects. And when families heard that pitch, we were pretty stunned that they recalled that pitch early on, and many families mentioned it when we asked them to tell us about the program or tell us about opportunity neighborhoods. And we heard accounts of really being excited and satisfied to have a chance to move to the kinds of communities that some parents had always wanted to move to. There are also was quite a bit of streamlining and sort of bandwidth, tax reducing help with housing search, brokering, social and cultural capital brokering with landlords. I'll get into this when I show you the data itself, and leveraging this flexible financial assistance, which is administered by the staff, but sort of they're funds that come in at just that moment where a landlord, maybe, one of the parents has spotty credit history, and the navigator says, well, we'll double the security deposit if you'd be willing to take a chance, right? So that's a way that the funds get leveraged flexibly in a customized way. But of course, the best way to describe this is not in my words, but to take the words for our families instead as evidence. When we asked Jackie to tell us about the CMTO program, she said, gosh, it was like a light bulb went off, and it was a flood of relief, right? Because she'd been asking herself, I don't know how I'm going to do this move back to the Seattle area. I don't know what I'm going to do. What I'm doing isn't working. And then she said, I think it was just the supportive nature of having lots of conversations with the family and housing navigators that really made the difference. She would later go on in the interview to describe, again, she said it was as if somebody nourished me and fed me with that support. Melinda told us that when she found out about the program and had the initial meeting, she said the navigator made me cry when she kind of explained to me what the program does. Like she says, it's not just that we pay your rent. It's to make sure that not only are you in a good area, but your child can grow up in an area and be successful. And it made me happy to think my son is going to be in an area that can help him be in a good part of society. So I think Lisa put a point on it when she was, on how the streamlining of housing search assistance, landlord recruitment, and support with application help, because she said, normally with the housing search process, it's like me staring on my phone to do online housing searches while my son is playing. And the less I have to do to find housing, that takes away from me focusing on him and the other things I need to do, the better, right? So this juggling, which is typical, sort of the putting out of fires, that is characteristic of life with serious resource constraints, is remedied with some of the staff help at these key moments. Leah was explaining that, with the housing navigators helped with landlords by saying, when you find a place, I'll come with you, help you fill out the application and talk to the landlord. I'll help you do that stuff that is sometimes complicated. Having the navigator brokers sometimes provide references themselves for families was a really big bridge. They're both, I think, because landlords often feel like they don't have enough information to deal with and are sometimes hesitant to work with the voucher program because of not having a face to connect with and having to deal with paperwork. And families are feeling similar kinds of lack of information and lack of support. And so this brokering is a key piece of the puzzle. And Jennifer's example really, I think, makes clear, right, how important the customized targeted financial assistance is. She explains, I'm not going to be able to pay my rent here, at the place I'm living in, the last rent, and then pay the new rent, right, at the new apartment, right, when I switch to finish out my lease. So the program was able to get me money so that they would pay the more of the first portion of my rent, because they understood the situation I was in. And, again, that kind of flexibility comes through quite a bit in our conversations with parents. And I think Nicole's story really shows how these pieces can fit together. And she, talks again about this experience of being denied a unit because of her credit. And she said, some landlords say, your credit could be denied, like mine has been. Mine was. I had this credit resume, though, that the CMTO staff helped her put together that was essentially a short essay explaining why the marks were on her credit, how they got there, what she's gone through, how she's getting them off with a payment plan, what she wants to do as a mom with her kids in this new move. And because of that, the landlord said, well, you seem smart, you seem like you're prepared, and maybe these things on your credit don't seem like a big deal. And then the navigator steps in and says, also, I'll give you a higher deposit if you give her a chance. And so this is sort of how a lot of these moves that might not have otherwise happened because of so many of these barriers ended up happening. I think in the interest of time, I'll just move to some key questions. I'm happy to, again, drill down into aspects of the intervention and some of what we learned about the mechanisms. Again, notably, information itself and just the provision of financial assistance is not enough. I think that's one of the key things to drive home that we learned from the qualitative work, that really made the difference. And we're expanding right now. The experiment is in phase 2 to try to parse out even more, how important the financial assistance is relative to having this supportive counseling. So I think it's always important, and I tell my policy students, many of whom have joined us today, that we want to be able to not just talk about benefits, but also talk about costs. And the total cost for a family in the treatment group for the program is about $2,600, closer to $4,000 for an opportunity neighborhood, or the revised estimate closer to $5,000 for the opportunity move. And this is about 2.2% of the total housing rental payment over a 7-year period. So in some ways, it's pennies on the dollar for the amount of money the voucher is worth to have the voucher have a family lease up in a higher opportunity neighborhood. The average amount of financial assistance used was only about $1,000. Families had up to $3,500 to use. So I'll finish with just sort of some conclusions and then a quick note about where we're going next. I think that the work in terms of contributions to our field and economics, I think one of the takeaways is that economic segregation in the United States appears to be driven not by deep-rooted preferences for where to live, but smaller barriers in the housing search process that we can overcome with intervention. In sociology, I think the part of what we're learning is that services to reduce these barriers can increase moves to opportunity and mobility. So it helps us sort of think through these big predictors of segregation, where we can intervene, testing which ones matter most. I think we consider the cost per family is about $2,600 per family issued a voucher, $5,000 for each opportunity move. And we look at the kinds of neighborhoods CMTO help families move to. When we simulate using the Opportunity Atlas, the outcomes for children who are at the base of that of the data for that map, we see that CMTO is predicted to increase the lifetime household income of children by about 8.4%, over $200,000 by mid-30s. And I think, what this also does is adds to this growing research base on policy efforts to increase neighborhood choice and why they matter, both place-based efforts like the, expansion of inclusionary zoning, as well as housing mobility itself. I think for next steps, we're continuing with the fieldwork. We're also going to be interviewing landlords to understand more about why some landlords participated, what was attractive about the program, and for those who didn't, perhaps why, as well as ongoing longitudinal follow-ups with families from phase 1, and also in the phase 2 part of the experiment where we have treatment arms that focus just on financial assistance and then just on light touch navigator services. And then a third group that's the phase 1 bundle of services compared to a control group, trying to understand sort of which kinds of families or which services matter. At what point is it not enough? At what point, does it take more than the financial incentive? And then is it effective to do lower cost, lighter touch intervention for, say, housing authorities who don't have, a couple extra $1,000 per family to administer these services. So the good news on this is that there's a lot of policy momentum right now. A Republican spearheaded bipartisan supported appropriation of $50 million has gone forward, half in 2018, half in 2019, to expand housing mobility in the United States. HUD it's a bright spot in the administration. HUD released the demonstration RFP, and cities across the country are applying. PHAs are applying to be part of the demonstration and get extra services to expand their voucher program with housing mobility interventions. So this is ongoing right now. We saw just before Christmas this year, in a previous iteration in 2019, Republican Senator Todd Young from Indiana and Democrat Chris Van Hollen from Maryland proposed the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, which was intended to increase vouchers, the total number of vouchers in the United States, but also services for mobility. And in the bill, notably emphasized the importance of a customized approach to enable the transition to opportunity areas. And this was based on our work in Seattle. So this is an exciting sort of policy moment and momentum building on the research evidence. So we're going to move forward and hopefully be able to partner with some of these other sites to expand to see how this might work in different kinds of housing markets, and to look further into the subgroup differences by race. Of course, a number of folks at Opportunity Insights and in my research lab are trying to also think about place-based efforts. I know it usually comes up in Q&A to think about, we can't just move people. We have to think about creating opportunity in place. How do we do that? How can we leverage what we're learning from CMTO and its expansion to do that right, in a place-based way? These are things that are front of mind. And with that, I'm going to stop and just sort of leave you with a thank you for letting me give this talk. This is a thank you note that I received when I did a follow-up interview with one of our respondents, and her daughter Jasmine was thanking me for doing the interview. So I'm thanking you for letting me do the talk. And this is sort of the larger team I want to give credit to, in addition to our funders, the Gates Foundation, the CZI, Sergo, and the William T. Grant Foundation. So with that, I'm going to stop and I welcome your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. There's so many nuggets and so many directions to go in this work, and I know we're all looking forward to seeing how it continues. For our audience members, if you have a question and you haven't popped it into the Q&A yet, Q&A box on Zoom yet, or on the comment box on Facebook yet, please do that. I see two great questions to get us started, so I'm just going to go in the order that we got them. The first one is from Sarah Hunter, and Sarah says, you described that CMTO has sort of these three major elements. Do we need all three? Are there ways to scale up any other element? Sorry, I should just read what she says. Are there ways to scale up these elements elsewhere? E.g., how much do they cost? Do you think it should be implemented or tested differently? So I'll let you respond to that and then we'll go to the next one.
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking right to sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a lag here on my slides, to what we're embarked on right now, which is the phase 2. Part of the RCT, it seems like not a lot of money to spend to get this, expansion of opportunity moves and increasing residential choice. But it's not, everybody's competing for small parts of money, and many PHAs, are contending with restrictions in funding to just administer vouchers, period, right? So we're trying to do that with the, phase 2, where we're looking at, one arm has the comprehensive supports that we described, and we're part of phase 1, and then a financial incentives only, and then a more cost optimized, lower touch set of interventions. And we're right now in the middle of interviewing families in these different treatment arms, but also we'll have analyses soon to answer this question. Can we get away with some improvements with smaller amounts of investment? I think this is vital. Money matters, and there's always this tough question of how many families can you serve, period, with the voucher program or with some kind of assistance, versus the smaller number of families you can support with all of these elements. So I really appreciate the question.
Great. And next we'll go to my colleague and USC Price Center Director, Gary Painter. And Gary asks, how does the navigation intervention compare to other housing navigation interventions? I can imagine a scenario where this intervention was more expensive than others, but proved to be more effective.
Yeah, I'm afraid that if I'm trying to remember where my slides are. I have a slide to compare this. It looks like I'm not able to get there for some reason, but hold on a sec here. It's later. Here we go. Hold on. Oh, here it is. Okay, I did move it up. So here we can look at just comparing the original Moving to Opportunity experiment with the CMTO, and looking here at the both, a characteristic of the income rank for neighborhoods, looking at the comparing that for conditional, unconditional, and lease up rates by group. We're seeing when we compare the control group, the Section 8 group only for MTO, and the experimental group, compared even to that, the CMTO intervention is much more effective. I think when comparing this to some of the other programs I mentioned, like the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, which I've been studying for quite some time, it's trickier because it's not an experiment, and the lease-up rates, relative to eligible families is a little bit harder to estimate, but the families in that, and this is a much more lax, at least in some Baltimore suburbs, more lax housing market, and some quite tight. About 90% of the families who are all African-American in that intervention leased up, and most families, it was over, so they, in that 90% reflects not just lease up, but lease up in neighborhoods that are not racially isolated and have poverty rates below 10%. That program is a locationally targeted one. So families had to lease up in neighborhoods that are that fit the criteria of being not racially isolated and not having a certain percentage of subsidized residents, and poverty rate, in part because the remedy was tied to the litigation. So, in order to get the voucher, families had to move to those neighborhoods. So it's a very different kind of setup. The estimate on that is that it's roughly in the ballpark of the cost of CMTO in terms of services. It's, the total rental costs are different because the costs are different in the housing markets, but, so it's roughly in the ballpark. And I think partly, right, that there's a lot, again, of lessons that were learned from previous mobility programs about what works. And I think moving forward, we're continuing to learn from CMTO as the HUD mobility demonstration moves forward to 6 to 10 new sites.
Great. I'm going to take my liberty as the moderator to ask a follow-up, because I find the navigation intervention, the navigator part, so interesting. To me, it almost reminds me of like the violence interrupters program in Chicago, where you kind of have these people ready to pop up at the moment where you need them to, kind of navigate, okay, well, what if we double the security deposit or whatever? And so I apologize if I missed this, but how long do the sort of navigator folks maintain contact with the family to help them, if in 6 months something pops up and they need help? Is that part of the program?
Yeah, so it's actually, I think it's fascinating too, Anne. That's why, I think in part because, it's a way of thinking about social policy more generally, right? Where we should, especially this kind of one-on-one supportive approach where, families are asked what they want and, what their vision is, as opposed to sort of a much, at least from families' perspectives, what I heard, very different approach than they're used to when working with social service agencies. I think, so it was, navigators spent an average of about 6 hours per family, and it was relatively, the communication varied also by family in terms of how much, families were reaching out, but there was quite a bit of outreach all the way through to the point of lease up, which could be anywhere from a couple of weeks to, 4 or 5 months. It's, it takes a while to lease up, as you all know, in some of these markets, and there were some extensions on the voucher so that it could be used. The window is long enough. So, up to, 4 or 5 months. And then the post-move period is one that both SHA and KCHA are talking about right now as they're moving into what they think of as their phase 3 sustainable model. Like, what do they do now that, that the funded intervention is over? with a focus on families who had wanted to, move, but couldn't, perhaps existing voucher holders who want to move, who weren't part of the intervention, also, these second moves, which are key. So I think, the question, is how to kind of balance those needs across those different groups. But it's definitely front of mind for the housing authorities as they're moving forward.
Great, thank you. Next, we have a question from Jared Schachner. Hey, Jared. Jared says, based on, my thing moved around. Based on initial qualitative findings, do you have a sense of how important online resources information are versus social networks to low-income families when making residential decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're, I'm sort of vibing with my research team right now on that. We're trying to find out how important online resources are, because at some point, right, the second phase of the experiment went virtual. That's something we're going to be learning about. We just launched about 2.5 weeks ago our phase 2 interviews. We were supposed to be there last March through June, but like many people, it was a bit diverted. So I think we're trying to find out exactly how effective, the availability of the website is to say, hey, I've got an apartment I'm interested in. Let me punch in the address is this in the kind of neighborhood where I'll get more resources to move. Okay. Email blast to say, have you, looked on the website lately, or, what kinds of help do you need? Or, I think in phase 1, at least, and in the sort of high touch treatment group in phase 2, there were still referrals of units sent by email and stuff, and some websites, and families were taught a bit about that. I mean, I think generally what we know, and this is from some of Peter Bergman's work, my Collaboration's project, that information, if you make, if you highlight information differently on websites like gosection8.com or some of the school report card websites, there are some small positive effects on how choices get made with that information kind of being elevated, say, school quality versus just bedroom size. So we have some evidence for that, which is a little bit of a different question. But I think, and the housing authorities are interested in knowing how much the online resources are helpful, because it's obviously far less expensive, but maybe there are ways to optimize providing that information.
Great, thank you. I just want to remind our viewers on Facebook that I believe our live stream will be ending, but we are still going to be on Zoom for a couple more minutes just to answer a few more questions. And maybe I will give you both of these at once, sort of in our last few minutes here. Maybe we'll end on one that might be particularly fun. So let's see, Joshua Kentong asks, wants, I think, you to elaborate with your thoughts on the 20-point gap between Black participants and white participants in moving to high opportunity areas. And also, do we think there might be differences in retention over time based on race? And then after we hear you reflect on that, maybe we'll close with a question from Ahad Iqbal, who wants to hear the Stefanie DeLuca benevolent dictator version of life. If you could sort of create a policy to address some of these findings, or maybe tweak CMTO, what might you do? So I'll just kind of let you riff on those.
Yeah, so for Joshua's question, I mean, I think we're, right now what we're doing is, focusing quite a bit of our qualitative interviews on both, immigrant families, native born families who, in our qualitative data, were less likely to lease up in opportunity neighborhoods, in addition to African-American families, to try to understand this gap. This is, obviously hugely important, not just for Seattle and what the housing authorities want to do moving forward, but nationally, of course. And I think that what we've been hearing from some of we're sort of in the middle of coding this data as we speak, and working on a piece that sort of looks at, why families didn't move if they did, and what some of the challenges were when they did for different groups of families. But I think what we heard is, some parents found schools in local neighborhoods that were mostly Black. So, the CD, the Central District, or South Seattle, or Beacon Hill, and wanted children to attend a school that they felt was diverse enough to, for their children to feel comfortable and learn how to live in a diverse society, and sort of a hesitation about moving to East King County, where they perceive the schools might be too white. There was, certainly fear of experiencing racism in some of these much more affluent neighborhoods in East. This is sort of east of, the King County, East King. So King County is both south and kind of like east around Seattle, but you cross over kind of Bill Gates' house and Mercer Island, keep going on the other side of that. You have some quite affluent suburbs like Bellevue, Issaquah, and such. And there were, Black families who talked about who had moved to some of these places and were excited to be in the school district, but others who, opted out and said, I don't want to have to experience anything. It's completely reasonable. I mean, I'm from Chicago, I live in Baltimore, and then did field work in Seattle. I mean, so traffic differs depending on where you are, obviously. And so, it's less of an issue in Baltimore than it was Chicago, but Seattle traffic is like really bad. So, we also heard, from some families that, and this was across racial groups, at least preliminarily, that just moving somewhere and having to commute, was just too much. And we experienced that as a research team to a degree that is hard to express. But again, I mean, this speaks, I think, to the, employment options that may be more or less available to families of color, for various reasons. And so I think we're still digging into this a bit more. It's certainly an area moving forward where we're focusing attention, especially in phase 2, to try to understand it. And I think this is vital, again, for this expansion. So, I think we heard from some of the East African families, some of our immigrant families, said, I remember interviewing a mom, and dad kind of popped in and out a little bit. They just had a baby of 4 days before I got there. I remember her saying, I got the opportunity areas thing. We just didn't want to do it because, we've got our community here, really quite clearly. So I totally got it. The navigators are great. But my husband is a home healthcare worker for another Somali gentleman who's next door, and that sort of thing. So I think what I think is fascinating, right, is that we want to kind of reframe our ideas of residential choice and figure out what does it mean to support that and expand that, right? And this is going to be an enduring policy question for some time.
Great. And as in our last minute or two, if there's any, if Stefanie DeLuca ran the world, what would we do?
Oh, I don't think we have time for that. No, I mean, I think as I was sort of hinting at really briefly, I think to this other question, I think one of the things we are learning is, and this, I don't know, again, this is probably not a surprise to the social workers in the group or folks who've worked with families and children, that I think there's a lot of wisdom to be gained in sort of doing ground level work, even if it's not research, sort of formative work to find out sort of where our policy assumptions are. So, I mean, I think I would sort of, sort of put a requirement in before policies are expanded, refunded, whatever, that, there's sort of some formative thinking about what our assumptions are about how these policies work and how they do or don't fall short when we overlay them with the reality of people's lives, and give credit, I think, to the difficult decisions, trade-offs, and strategies that every single day, poor families are making without any assistance, and sort of really, I think, make it's a bit more of a participant-informed policy framework. I guess that's what I'm going to call it. But that's kind of think what I really am struck by, just how much we have to learn. And it often is that kind of knowledge. And from our practice partners, our housing authorities and staff, I mean, these are the frontline folks who have extraordinary wisdom. And we really should be listening.
Great. A great lesson for all researchers, all graduate students interested in this space. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. This was fascinating to learn more about, and I know we'll all have our eyes on it. Please join me in virtually thanking Professor Stefanie DeLuca, and thank you so much.
Right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And please, Anne, can you collect any other questions? So I just like to see them and have folks follow up by email.
Sounds good. I'll send you an email.
Okay, great.
All right, great. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks. Take care.